Between March of 1852 and the winter of 1853, whispers spread through the cobblestone streets of Boston. Whispers about young men, heirs to fortunes, sons of merchants, rising lawyers, who vanished into the brick mansion of a wealthy widow on Beacon Hill and who did not live long after their visits. The city's newspapers carried only brief notices: accidental deaths, sudden drownings, unexplainable heart failures. What the public never learned, what polite society would never dare to speak aloud, was that each of these young men had signed an agreement, a contract written in Margaret Lawrence's hand, a contract that bound them to her daughters, not in marriage, but in flesh. Margaret was Boston's richest widow, her estate sprawling across Mount Vernon Street like a fortress of secrets. After the sudden death of her husband, she had retreated behind those iron gates with her 3 daughters, Catherine, Elizabeth, and Anne. From that moment on, the girls ceased to be seen at church, ceased to attend gatherings, ceased to walk Beacon Hill's gas-lit streets. They were being prepared for something else, something darker. The contracts promised $3,000 in exchange for absolute silence and participation in what Margaret described as an experiment in heredity. Young men of strong bloodlines, untouched by disease, descended from Mayflower stock, were invited into her home. They were not invited to court her daughters. They were invited to impregnate them. Behind velvet drapes and locked doors, Margaret oversaw the couplings as though they were transactions of livestock, not unions of human souls. She had studied in Prussia before coming to Boston, and she brought with her an obsession with selective breeding, the belief that humanity could be perfected if carefully engineered. Now, with her daughters as vessels and her wealth as shield, she was determined to create a new line of men and women, stronger, smarter, untainted by what she called the corruption of ordinary marriages. And every deal came at a price. 9 months after signing, each man was gone. His death ruled an accident. His family compensated just enough to prevent questions. Beacon Hill's elite looked away, for they knew the widow's fortune could silence even the law. Before we descend deeper into this forbidden truth, I want to know where you are listening from. Comment your city or state below, and subscribe if you are drawn to secrets history tried to erase. And if you feel the veil thinning as you hear this, type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal it within you. The first contract was signed in April of 1852. The man's name was Jonathan Pierce, a 23-year-old law student, son of a shipping magnate whose family had more power than even the newspapers dared to challenge. Jonathan was known for his arrogance, his confidence, his flawless health, exactly the kind of specimen Margaret Lawrence sought. The arrangement began with a dinner, oysters brought in from Provincetown, Madeira wine uncorked in crystal goblets. Catherine, the eldest daughter, was presented in a silk dress that gleamed like water under candlelight. No one would have guessed she had been hidden away for years. No one would have suspected she was less a bride than a participant in her mother's carefully staged ritual. Jonathan laughed that evening, charmed by Margaret's eloquence and disarmed by the strange flattery that filled the room. She spoke to him not as a guest, but as if he were chosen, as if his very existence was a prize. By midnight, when the contract was placed before him, the young man's hand barely trembled. $3,000, more money than many workers saw in a lifetime, in exchange for secrecy and submission to the widow's terms. He signed. But Jonathan Pierce would not live to see the birth of the child he conceived. Months later, his body was discovered floating near Long Wharf, his lungs filled with water though no one saw him fall. The coroner listed it as drowning. The newspapers printed 2 lines, and Margaret paid the Pierce family handsomely, her lawyers ensuring the scandal never reached trial. Catherine, meanwhile, carried the pregnancy to term. Margaret demanded that her daughter never leave the house during those months. Shutters drawn, servants threatened with dismissal if a word escaped their lips. And when the child was born, Margaret's obsession became clearer. She kept meticulous notes: eye color, head shape, grip strength of the newborn's hands. This was not motherhood. It was inventory. Boston's high society had no language for what was happening behind those red brick walls. They called Margaret eccentric, private, touched by grief. But in whispers, servants spoke of her imported German books, of diagrams showing bloodlines interlaced like spiderwebs, of letters to a mysterious doctor in Leipzig who urged her to continue. Jonathan's death should have raised suspicion, but in Boston death was common. Cholera shipwrecks and winter fevers filled the graveyards. And so the truth hid in plain sight. Margaret Lawrence was conducting experiments with flesh, hiding her laboratory in a mansion that the city praised as one of its most respectable homes. But Jonathan was only the beginning. The contracts did not stop, and neither did the deaths. Before we go deeper into the second arrangement, I want you to answer something for yourself. If you were alive in Boston in 1852 and someone you knew was chosen, would you have seen the danger, or would you, like the others, have looked away? Comment below. And remember, every silence in history was purchased. By autumn of 1852, Margaret Lawrence was already preparing for her second arrangement. Catherine had birthed her child, and the widow treated the infant not as a grandchild, but as a specimen to be studied. She measured the shape of its skull with brass calipers, recorded the first teeth that broke through its gums, and tested the child's reflexes with a cold precision that horrified even the servants. To her, this was progress, proof that her theories of controlled bloodlines were taking root. But one child was not enough. Her obsession demanded patterns, repetitions, and comparisons, and so her attention shifted to her second daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth was softer, more timid than Catherine. She had been her father's favorite, and even after his death, she wept for him in ways her mother called weakness. Yet weakness did not spare her. Margaret arranged for Elizabeth's suitor not through dinner, but through the Harvard Club, a place where young men of privilege drank brandy and whispered about women as if they were possessions. It was there she found Edward Thorne, the son of a judge, tall and broad-shouldered, rumored to have never been sick a day in his life. Perfect blood, strong seed, that was all Margaret cared to know. Unlike Jonathan Pierce, Edward did not require persuasion. He was lured by the promise of money and by the allure of secrecy. The contract was slid before him in the study, its ink barely dry, its clauses binding him to silence even unto death. He laughed as he signed, calling it the strangest marriage proposal in Boston's history. He had no idea how close to truth that jest was. Elizabeth did not laugh. She wept when Margaret told her what was to come. She begged her mother to release her, begged to be sent to relatives in New Hampshire, begged to be spared. But Margaret's hand was iron. "You were born for this," she told her daughter. "You will endure, and through you the family will be reborn." When Elizabeth's child quickened in her womb, Edward Thorne's fate sealed itself. By December, his body was discovered in Cambridge, slumped against a bridge rail, his face pale, his chest unmoving. The doctors called it heart failure, but those who saw him last swore he was the picture of vitality. Another healthy man, another sudden death, another silence purchased. Now Beacon Hill's whispers grew louder. 2 men gone in the same year, both connected to the Lawrence house. Servants fled without warning, and families began instructing their sons to steer clear of Margaret's invitations. Yet nothing was done, for her money spoke louder than any suspicion, and her reputation as a grieving widow shielded her from the city's gaze. But inside the mansion, the shadows lengthened. 2 daughters used, 2 men dead, 2 infants catalogued like livestock. And still, Margaret was not finished. Her eye had already turned to her youngest child, Anne. The girl was only 16. Before we open that door, ask yourself this: how much of what you call morality is real, and how much of it is only fear of being caught? Because Margaret had no fear, only purpose. Anne Lawrence was the youngest, the most fragile, and perhaps the only one who still believed in innocence. At 16, she had been sheltered almost entirely within the red brick mansion. She read poetry by candlelight, embroidered by the window, and hummed hymns her father once sang. She had not yet been hardened like Catherine, nor broken like Elizabeth. But Margaret saw in her the last vessel, the last thread of her design. The widow's obsession with controlled lineage demanded 3 trials, 3 children from 3 daughters, born of carefully selected men. To her, this would prove her theory beyond doubt. But with Anne, the plan would take a darker turn. For the wealthy bachelors of Boston had begun to sense danger in her invitations. The sudden deaths of Jonathan Pierce and Edward Thorne were too close together, too convenient. Whispers spread through Beacon Hill drawing rooms. Mothers warned their sons. Margaret could no longer openly recruit, so she turned to secrecy. She reached out beyond Boston, contacting a family in Salem with ties to her late husband. From them she found Charles Davenport, a distant cousin by marriage, just 21. He was known for his striking health and his family's pure English lineage, exactly the kind of traits Margaret valued. But unlike the others, Charles did not walk into the arrangement by choice. He was lured under pretense. He was told he was to meet relatives, to dine and discuss inheritances. Instead, he found himself cornered inside Margaret's study, a contract placed before him, the doors locked, servants silent as statues. Margaret spoke with a force that shook him. She told him it was his duty to the bloodline, his obligation to ensure the Lawrence name did not rot into mediocrity. Charles resisted. He threatened to leave, to alert the police, to expose her schemes. But Margaret had anticipated resistance. Her wealth was power, and her power was fear. Within a week, Charles Davenport was not only bound by contract, he was bound by silence. Some say blackmail was used, others say threats. But what is certain is that by spring of 1853, Anne Lawrence carried his child. Unlike her sisters, Anne's spirit cracked. She was not hardened by obedience, nor numbed by resignation. She was shattered. She stopped singing her hymns, stopped reading her poetry. She was seen staring for hours into the mirrors of the mansion, as if searching for a way to escape her own reflection. Servants whispered that she spoke at night to the unborn child, begging it not to come into this world. And then, in May of 1853, Charles Davenport was found dead. His body was discovered on a dirt road outside Salem, his skull fractured, his horse wandering free. The local papers blamed a fall, but those who knew Charles saw he was an expert rider. Impossible to throw. Another man dead. Another silence purchased. 3 daughters used. 3 men dead. 3 infants born into secrecy. And Boston, a city that prided itself on its civility and religion, remained blind. Or perhaps it chose blindness. For the Lawrence mansion was too powerful to question. But the story does not end with those 3 births. No, it only begins there. For what Margaret Lawrence created inside that house would ripple outward for generations. Before we open the next chapter, I'll ask you this: if a family line was engineered, shaped not by love, but by design, do you think its descendants would ever escape the curse of their creation? By the summer of 1853, the Lawrence mansion held 3 infants: Catherine's son, Elizabeth's daughter, and Anne's fragile newborn. To the outside world, they were whispered about as orphans or wards, children taken in by a grieving widow. No one beyond those iron gates spoke their true origin. But inside the mansion, Margaret Lawrence treated them not as grandchildren, not as blessings, but as subjects in an experiment she believed would change the future of mankind. She kept her study lit through the night, candles burning low over stacks of notebooks imported from Leipzig. In those pages she wrote every detail: the infants' bone lengths, their eye color shifts, their appetite, their first words, the exact number of seconds it took them to stop crying once startled. She noted which one reached for objects first, which one smiled earliest, which one displayed the stronger grip. She called it the chart of superior heredity. The servants were forbidden to show affection. Do not cradle them when they weep, Margaret ordered. Do not rock them. They must grow strong on discipline, not on indulgence. And so, in the nursery, the children's cries often went unanswered, echoing down the marble halls like ghostly hymns. Catherine's boy, named Nathaniel, was the most restless. He stared at adults with unnerving intensity, as if measuring them, as if aware. Elizabeth's daughter, Cara, was quiet, almost too quiet, her silence mistaken by Margaret as a sign of intellectual promise. And Anne's child, Samuel, was fragile from the start, thin, pale, prone to fevers that Margaret recorded as defects. She wrote beside his entries in red ink, "Weakness must be bred out." The daughters themselves were given no say in the raising of their children. Catherine complied with resignation, Elizabeth with sorrow, and Anne with a silence that bordered on madness. She was seen wandering the halls at night, pressing her ear to the nursery door, whispering to the child she was not allowed to hold. And yet, in Margaret's eyes, all of this was success. 3 children, born of chosen men, raised under calculated conditions. She told herself she was building the foundation of a perfected line, a dynasty of strength and intelligence that would one day shape Boston and perhaps the world. But perfection cannot be built on blood without consequence. For as the children grew, strange signs began to appear. Nathaniel's eyes seemed to track things no one else could see. Clara spoke words she had never been taught, and Samuel, frail Samuel, sometimes fell into long trances, whispering phrases in languages no one in the mansion claimed to know. The servants crossed themselves. Some fled, refusing to serve in a house where infants spoke with voices too old for their age. But Margaret was blind to fear. She saw only promise. She saw only the dawn of her vision. What she did not see, or refused to see, was that with every breath, with every unnatural act, the Lawrence line was moving further away from humanity. Before we open the next door, ask yourself this: do you believe evil is inherited or engineered? By 1855, the three Lawrence children were no longer infants. They were toddlers, walking the echoing marble halls of Beacon Hill with a presence that unsettled even the hardened servants. Margaret called them the proof, but others whispered another word: unnatural. Nathaniel, Catherine's boy, was the boldest. At 3 years old, he could recall entire passages from books read aloud only once. When scolded, he did not cry. He stared, unblinking, with an expression that made grown men uneasy. One servant claimed Nathaniel repeated back her private prayers in perfect detail, though she had never spoken them aloud. Clara, Elizabeth's daughter, was quieter but stranger. By the time she could form sentences, she was asking questions no child should ask. Why do people die if death is not the end? She whispered to the housemaid one night. Why do they pretend to sleep when they are not sleeping? Margaret took this as brilliance. The servants called it possession. And then there was Samuel, Anne's frail son. His body was weak, his fevers constant, yet when illness struck, his mind seemed to sharpen. He spoke in his sleep, uttering words in German, Latin, even fragments of Greek, languages he had never been taught. One night Anne swore she heard her son mutter her dead father's name, repeating it over and over until she fled the nursery in terror. To Margaret, this was vindication. To her, these were not curses but signs. She began inviting select guests into her home, men of influence who shared her obsession with purity of blood. Behind closed doors, she presented the children as marvels. She made Nathaniel recite psalms from memory, had Clara speak of dreams that foretold small events, and placed Samuel before them to show how a child near death could still articulate words from lost civilizations. The guests left in awe, but also in fear. They whispered about the widow's experiments, about her engineered children, but they never spoke publicly. To accuse Margaret Lawrence was to invite ruin. Her wealth could bury reputations, and her connections could silence the loudest critic. But not everyone was silent. A reverend from King's Chapel wrote in his journal that the Lawrence mansion had become a house of abominations. He noted that what he witnessed was not of God, but of some older power reaching through the children. His journal never made it to the pulpit. Weeks later, the Reverend resigned his post and left Boston without explanation. The daughters, meanwhile, suffered in silence. Catherine buried herself in numb obedience. Elizabeth wept behind locked doors. Anne grew skeletal, her mind unraveling each time she heard her child speak words that no one had taught him. But Margaret pressed forward, convinced she was building a dynasty that would surpass every noble line in New England. What she refused to see, or what she deliberately ignored, was that the children were not loyal to her. Already, at such a young age, they seemed bound not to their mother, nor to their grandmother, but to something else, something unseen, something that watched through them. And in 1856, when Nathaniel was only 4, that something would reveal itself in a way Margaret could no longer dismiss. Before we open that moment, consider this: do you believe that knowledge, when twisted, becomes sorcery, or is sorcery simply knowledge stripped of morality? It happened in the winter of 1856. Boston was wrapped in snow, its streets muffled beneath a white silence, but inside the Lawrence mansion the air was heavy, tense, and unholy. Nathaniel, at just 4 years old, had begun to frighten even his grandmother. Margaret had arranged another gathering of select men, wealthy patrons, professors, and a physician from Cambridge who had corresponded with her about the science of heredity. The children were brought into the parlor, dressed in fine clothes, as though they were prizes at an exhibition. Nathaniel stood tallest. Clara watched from the corner with her wide, two knowing eyes, and Samuel trembled in Anne's arms, sickly and pale but whispering still. Margaret instructed Nathaniel to recite. He did. Entire passages of Cicero, in Latin. The men marveled. Then, unprompted, he turned and fixed his gaze on one of the guests, a banker from Tremont Street. "You dream of drowning," the boy said flatly. "The river pulls you under, and the rope on your ankle drags you deeper. You think it will happen in spring." The room froze. The banker's face drained of color. No one had told Nathaniel about the man's recurring nightmares. Not his wife, not his closest friends. It was a secret he had carried for years. Yet the boy knew. Margaret smiled coldly, trying to frame it as brilliance, as a parlor trick of memory. But Nathaniel wasn't finished. His eyes rolled back, his voice dropped low, far lower than any child's voice should sound. And he spoke again. "It will not be spring. It will be winter. The ice will break, and you will fall through." The banker staggered to his feet, pale and shaking, muttering that he would not stay another minute in this cursed house. He fled into the snow, and he never returned to Beacon Hill again. Months later, the man's body was indeed found beneath the Charles River ice. Even Margaret faltered. For the first time, she saw not just genius, but something else. Something her books from Prussia had not promised her. Something that looked back through Nathaniel's eyes, ancient and merciless. She told herself it was only chance, coincidence, the imagination of a child. But in her private journal, written in a hand more frantic than usual, she confessed. The line speaks things it should not know. Catherine was horrified, Elizabeth trembled, and Anne began to unravel. She told the servants her son Samuel was whispering to her at night, telling her what awaited them all. Words she refused to repeat, words that left her sobbing until dawn. Yet Margaret pressed forward. Fear to her was weakness. She could not admit her life's work was birthing monsters. So she doubled down. She began new lessons for the children, instructing them in languages, in sciences, in scripture. She believed discipline would contain whatever force moved through them. But what Margaret refused to understand was this: you cannot bind a storm with paper, and you cannot chain what is older than blood. By the end of that year, the Lawrence mansion was no longer a house. It was a shrine, and every soul inside it was a prisoner to the children they had created. By 1857, Samuel, Anne's frail child, had become the center of unease within the Lawrence mansion. Unlike Nathaniel, who carried his unsettling power with pride, or Clara, whose silence cut deeper than words, Samuel seemed to hover on the edge of death. His skin was pale, his chest rattled when he breathed, and fevers struck him without warning. Yet it was in those fevers that his true horror revealed itself. When Samuel burned with illness, he did not cry. He spoke, sometimes in a voice too old, too deep for his small body, sometimes in tongues that no one in the mansion could recognize. Anne, broken and trembling, would sit by his bed as he whispered things no child could know. He spoke of the servants' hidden sins, affairs, thefts, secret pregnancies. He named them aloud, one after another, until the household staff began to resign in terror. But it wasn't only sins of the present. Samuel spoke of things yet to come. One night, during a violent fever, he told Margaret that fire would devour a certain warehouse by the docks, and within a week, flames consumed it. Another night he whispered that a storm would sink a merchant ship bound for Charleston, and within days news arrived of its wreck. Margaret should have been shaken, but she wrote it all down, feverishly, obsessively, as though every prophecy was proof of her success. She called Samuel the oracle of the line. She told Anne that her son was destined, that his weakness of flesh was compensated by strength of spirit. But Anne did not see destiny. She saw damnation. The servants who remained began to cross themselves when passing Samuel's room. Some whispered that he was not a child at all, but a vessel, a mouthpiece for something that had slipped into this world through Margaret's ambition. And at night, Anne swore she heard voices answering Samuel, voices that came not from her son, but from the shadows of the nursery itself. One evening, when Margaret tried to coax Samuel into another demonstration, For her guests, the boy collapsed into a violent seizure. His eyes rolled white, his limbs twisted, and from his mouth poured a stream of Latin so rapid no one could follow. The physician present that evening fled the house in terror, declaring he would never return. Margaret, unshaken, scribbled every word into her journals. What she refused to admit, what she could not bear to face, was that Samuel's words were not random. Weeks later, a scholar she sent the transcripts to identified fragments of them as lines from forbidden texts of early Rome, words linked not to scripture, but to ancient rites of blood sacrifice. Anne broke entirely. She began refusing food, pacing the halls, screaming that her child was not her own. Elizabeth begged Margaret to stop. Catherine grew silent, bitter, watching her mother destroy what little was left of them. But Margaret, she could not turn back. She was too deep. Her fortune, her reputation, her very identity were now tied to the success of these children. To abandon the experiment would mean admitting she had birthed monsters. But the truth was already out of her hands. The Lawrence children were no longer hers to control. And in 1858, when Samuel's fever reached its peak, he spoke a single sentence that would forever change the fate of the family. "When we are grown, we will consume the house." The year was 1858, and though Boston outside the gates bustled with progress, railroads expanding, industry rising, fortunes growing, the Lawrence mansion stood still, heavy and rotting from the inside. Samuel's words, "When we are grown, we will consume the house," echoed in every room like a curse that refused to leave. Strange things began to happen within those brick walls. Doors that had been locked at night were found standing open in the morning, though no servant admitted to moving them. Food spoiled faster than it should, milk curdled within hours of entering the kitchen, bread turned moldy overnight. Mirrors cracked without cause, and oil lamps flickered violently whenever the children entered a room. Nathaniel, at 6 years old, was no longer a child in spirit. He questioned adults with the tone of a man, demanded obedience from servants twice his size, and carried himself like a master of the house. Clara, though only 5, unnerved everyone with her silence. She would stand in corners for hours, watching without blinking, as though she were listening to voices only she could hear. And Samuel, his fevers came and went, but each left him thinner, weaker, and yet his words sharper, darker. Anne had descended into hysteria, screaming that the house itself was listening, that the walls whispered her son's name. Elizabeth began drinking in secret, hiding bottles of port beneath her bed, numbing herself against the terror. Catherine alone stayed cold and hard, her face a mask, as though she had surrendered to the fate her mother forced upon them. The servants who remained refused to work in the nursery after dark. They claimed the children's toys moved on their own. One maid swore she heard Samuel's weak voice echoing down the hallway when he was fast asleep in his bed. Another swore Clara's reflection in a mirror did not match her movements. Within months, nearly the entire staff had quit. The mansion grew eerily quiet. Only Margaret remained unshaken, scribbling in her journals, filling page after page with her observations. To her, the disturbances were not hauntings but data, signs that the children's minds were evolving beyond ordinary human limitation. She believed she was standing on the threshold of a new humanity, and her family would be its architects. But the cracks were already widening. The city outside had begun to take notice. Neighbors whispered that no laughter, no music, no normal sound ever came from the Lawrence mansion anymore. Only silence, only shadows. The church on Beacon Hill spoke of unnatural happenings, though no one dared accuse Margaret directly. Then, one night it happened. A thunderstorm broke over Boston, rattling the windows with violent rain. Servants who remained swore they heard the children chanting together in the nursery, their voices rising and falling in unison, speaking words none of them had been taught. When the storm cleared, the mansion reeked of smoke. Though no fire had touched it, Margaret found the walls of the nursery blackened with strange soot, as if scorched from within. The children stood unharmed in the center of the room, their eyes wide, their faces calm, as if nothing had happened at all. And Margaret, for the first time, did not write in her journals. She simply sat in the nursery chair until dawn, staring at the children, her lips pressed tight as though she had begun to fear the truth. The prophecy had begun. The children were growing, And the house, their cage, their cradle, their shrine, was already being consumed. Before we step further, consider this: when a house rots, do you blame the builder or the thing that lives inside? By the winter of 1858, the Lawrence mansion had transformed into something more than brick and stone. It no longer felt like a house. It pulsed. It breathed. And those who stepped across its threshold often whispered, once safely outside, that it seemed the very walls were listening. Margaret Lawrence had achieved what she believed to be triumph. The children were no longer infants but eerie prodigies. Nathaniel at 5, Clara at 4, Samuel barely 3, yet each already exhibiting gifts their peers could not dream of. Margaret delighted in showcasing them privately. Nathaniel's ability to recite entire passages from books he had only glanced at once. Clara's talent for repeating in perfect cadence conversations she overheard even from floors away. Samuel's ability to still his breath for unnervingly long minutes as though already half ghost. But something unspoken gnawed at the servants who remained. At night, when they crossed the dark halls, they swore they heard scratching inside the walls. Not rats, not insects. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging against plaster. More than one servant claimed they'd seen doors open before they touched them, or candles sputter violently when Clara entered a room. Margaret dismissed these as fears of the uneducated. "We are advancing," she said. Progress always terrifies the small-minded. But even she began to notice things she did not record in her notebooks. Nathaniel spoke of a man who visited his bedside, a man with no face, who whispered instructions only he could hear. Clara began drawing symbols she could not have learned, spirals and sigils that unnerved even her mother Elizabeth. And Samuel, pale Samuel, often awoke screaming, pointing at the nursery ceiling as if something crawled above the rafters. The daughters were unraveling. Catherine drank secretly from the brandy stores. Elizabeth begged her mother to stop the experiments, to let the children live normal lives. Anne, already brittle from years of silence, cut her hand open one night, scratching at the nursery wall, insisting she could hear whispers behind it. Yet Margaret pressed forward. Her gatherings with Boston's elite became more elaborate, her displays of the children more daring. She had begun to speak of opening a school, not for many, but for a select few. A place where chosen bloodlines could be refined, perfected, prepared to rule. It was no longer enough to control her daughters. Now she sought to control the future itself, and the mansion, as if feeding on her ambition, seemed to grow darker, heavier, more suffocating with each passing month. What Margaret refused to see was simple. She was not shaping the children. Something else was shaping them, and it was shaping her too. The first official record of the Lawrence children did not come from Margaret herself, nor from her terrified daughters. It came from a physician named Dr. Alistair Horton, a man of science, skeptical of superstition, and confident in his ability to explain away fear with reason. He had been summoned under the pretense of general wellness examinations for the children, but whispers in Boston said otherwise. Some said Margaret wanted to prove her breeding experiment had succeeded. Others claimed one of the daughters, Elizabeth, had secretly begged him to come, fearing for her daughter Clara's health, or perhaps her soul. Houghton arrived in December of 1858, a week before Christmas. His diary, later discovered among his effects, describes his first impression of the mansion in chilling detail. "It is not simply a home," he wrote. "It is a mausoleum. The corridors smell of iron and damp paper. One feels observed, though no servant lingers long enough to watch. The widow Lawrence carries herself with authority, but her eyes are fevered, lit with a private fire. She believes herself at the frontier of some great truth. I fear it is a truth only madness can reveal." When Houghton examined the children, he found their physical health oddly inconsistent. Nathaniel's pulse, he wrote, was unusually slow for a child so energetic. Clara's vision was perfect beyond measure, allowing her to identify distant objects with accuracy no child her age should possess. Samuel's heartbeat often skipped, then surged erratically, though he never complained of pain. But what unsettled him most were their behaviors. Nathaniel asked the doctor questions about anatomy he could not have learned without formal study. About the thickness of the skull, about the weight of the brain, about the color of thoughts. Clara repeated, word for word, sentences Halton had spoken privately to Margaret in another room, her childish voice eerily precise. And Samuel, upon seeing Halton's leather case of instruments, whispered a single phrase that froze the doctor in place. "You'll use those on us when she tells you." Halton demanded an explanation from Margaret. She dismissed his unease with a laugh. "They are exceptional," she said. "What you mistake for illness is superiority. The world is changing, doctor, and I am simply the first to guide it." But in his diary, Halton wrote a very different conclusion. "These children are not natural. They are not products of chance heredity. They are being cultivated, yes, but by what, or by whom, I cannot say. I saw in their eyes not innocence, not mischief, but calculation. They are watching us as much as we are watching them. The widow believes she is their maker. She is not. She is their servant." Within a week, Dr. Halton fled Boston. He never returned to the mansion nor spoke of it publicly. His notes, however, survived, and in them lay the first chilling testimony that the Lawrence experiment was no longer in Margaret's control. The question remained who, or what, truly was. When Dr. Halton left Boston in haste, he carried more than his leather case. He carried dread, the kind a rational man does not confess aloud. But dread has a way of leaking, and by early 1859, his silence had already birthed whispers among his colleagues. He made vague remarks about a house where children spoke with borrowed tongues, and a widow more devoted to power than to God. He never named Margaret Lawrence directly, but Boston was small and society gossip smaller. Soon, within parlors and drawing rooms, the Lawrence name began to surface in murmured tones. The rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the widow had struck a bargain with unseen forces to preserve her wealth. Others whispered that the children were not entirely human, that they had been born under a curse. One particularly poisonous story suggested that Margaret had stolen infants from other families, raising them as her own in some secret ritual. Margaret, of course, denied nothing, but neither did she deny everything. When confronted by her closest confidantes, she smiled with the poise of a queen and said, "Every great lineage is misunderstood in its infancy. They called Newton a madman, they called Galileo a heretic. History punishes the visionary." But denial meant little. The servants who fled the mansion told their own stories, of rooms that smelled of sulphur, of portraits that wept in the night, of children whose laughter came from two voices at once. Each tale grew darker in the retelling, and the more Boston society tried to suppress these rumors, the more they spread. Church leaders began to take notice. A minister from Cambridge declared in a sermon that bloodlines are not to be perfected, but redeemed. An obvious strike at the widow Lawrence without naming her. Some whispered that the Catholic Church had dispatched quiet observers to the estate, though no official record confirms it. The Lawrence daughters felt the weight most. Catherine was shunned by former friends. Elizabeth's invitation ceased. Anne withdrew further into silence, barely leaving her chambers. They had become prisoners not only of their mother, but of society's judgment. And yet Margaret did not bend. She leaned into the fear, hosting her gatherings with even more daring spectacle, presenting her grandchildren before hushed audiences. It was as if she enjoyed forcing others to see not just their brilliance, but their strangeness. But Margaret failed to realize something crucial. Whispers have power. They gather weight. They become truth long before proof arrives. And in Boston, a city built on Puritan bones and Calvinist shadows, whispers of blood curses and forbidden experiments did not fade. They multiplied. And from those whispers would come something far more dangerous than superstition scrutiny. For where there is scrutiny, there is exposure. And the Lawrence legacy could not withstand exposure. By the spring of 1859, the Lawrence estate was no longer merely a house of whispers. It had become a battlefield of ideas, one where faith, politics, and ambition collided with Margaret's obsession. The rumors had spread too far. Rival families in Boston, eager to see the once dominant Lawrences diminished, seized upon the stories. The Parkers, the Winthrops, the Endicotts, old names with old grudges, began to hint in their gatherings that Margaret Lawrence was not only eccentric, but dangerous. They reminded society that she had buried a husband under mysterious circumstances, that her daughters had vanished into shadows, that her home was sealed against the world like a fortress. And now, they said, she had unleashed something unnatural into the city. The ministers joined the chorus. From pulpits, warnings were preached against the arrogance of remaking God's design. Priests and pastors alike, usually divided, found unity in condemning her. To them, Margaret was not a widow advancing science. She was Eve in Boston's garden, offering forbidden fruit to anyone foolish enough to taste. But perhaps most dangerous of all were the politicians. Massachusetts in 1859 was a state strained by debates over slavery, industry, and reform. The Lawrence family name still carried economic weight in shipping and textiles. If Margaret's reputation rotted, her family's influence would rot with it. Rivals in the legislature began to mutter about corruption, about improper contracts, about how wealth obtained from tainted blood should not steer Boston's future. Inside the mansion, the pressure was suffocating. Margaret felt the shift but refused to retreat. "They will not break me," she declared. "They will kneel, as they always do." She doubled down on her secret exhibitions, drawing smaller but more fanatical audiences. Not men of science now, but men who hungered for control, industrialists, occult dabblers, power brokers who whispered about building dynasties that would last centuries. And the children, they became both trophies and prisoners. Nathaniel's questions grew more unnerving, his gaze sharper, as if he were cataloging the weaknesses of those who came to see him. Clara's drawings of spirals and sigils began to appear on the margins of Margaret's guest ledgers, as though she marked each visitor for reasons unknown. And Samuel, pale, trembling Samuel, began to speak in riddles, warning that a storm is already inside the house. The daughters could endure no more. Elizabeth begged her mother to stop, warning her that the scrutiny would soon lead to ruin. Catherine threatened to take her son and flee. Anne, half-mad, whispered of fire, that the house would not survive the summer. But Margaret silenced them all. She told her daughters what she told herself: "You are witnessing the birth of immortality. History does not remember those who were comfortable. It remembers those who conquered." Yet what Margaret could not see was this: the more she sought to control her destiny, the more she was losing control of her own house. The Lawrence name was now a warning, not a crown. And the storm Samuel whispered of, it was no longer waiting. It was already clawing at the walls. The first true confrontation came in the autumn of 1859, when the whispers of Boston could no longer be contained. A delegation arrived at the Lawrence estate, not servants, not curious neighbors, but emissaries. At their head was Reverend Josiah Cutter of Cambridge, a man with a voice like thunder and a reputation for breaking heretics in his sermons. Flanking him were two respected members of Boston society, Elias Winthrop and Charles Endicott, both descended from old money, both rivals of the Lawrence name. Their stated purpose was simple: to inquire into the welfare of the Lawrence children. But everyone in the city knew what it truly was: an inquest, a test, an attempt to pry open the doors Margaret had kept sealed for so long. Margaret did not flinch. She welcomed them with her usual regal composure, guiding them into the drawing room as though she had nothing to fear. The candles burned low, the air heavy with wax and dust. The visitors noticed the silence first. No laughter of children, no movement in the halls, just an oppressive stillness, as if the house itself were listening. Reverend Cutter wasted no time. "The city grows restless," he said. "Rumors of unnatural practices, of experiments unblessed by God. We must see the children. For if what is spoken is false, it should be proven false. And if true—" His voice trailed into an ominous hush. Margaret smiled. "You shall see them," she replied. "But understand this: greatness is never recognized by the fearful. What you call unnatural, I call progress." She summoned the children into the room. Nathaniel entered first, standing tall for his age, his gaze sharp enough to make the Winthrop hair shift uneasily. Clara followed, clutching a notebook of drawings she refused to let go. Samuel lingered behind, pale and trembling, his eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting something to lunge from them. At first, the emissaries tried to play their roles. They asked Nathaniel his lessons, Clara her prayers, Samuel his health. But the children did not answer as children should. Nathaniel responded with questions of his own, probing the men about their fears, their sins, Their secret ambitions. Clara, without prompting, recited a private argument Elias Winthrop had had with his wife 2 nights prior. And Samuel, shaking, whispering, looked at Reverend Cutter and said, "He's already standing behind you." The Reverend spun around, but nothing was there. Still, the color drained from his face. The visitors left shortly after, muttering vague thanks but leaving with haste. None stayed for the meal Margaret offered. None spoke another word to the widow on their way out, but outside the gates their fear hardened into resolve. The Lawrence mansion was no longer a curiosity. It was a threat, and what is feared by ministers, by rivals, by men of power, is never left to rot quietly. It is purged. By winter's edge, the Lawrence mansion was no longer just a house on the hill. It was a wound in Boston's conscience. The Reverend's visit had confirmed the whispers. The Winthrops and Endicotts had seen enough to convince themselves of one truth: Margaret Lawrence was dangerous, and the children she kept were worse. Behind closed doors, a quiet alliance formed. Ministers and rivals met in candlelit parlors, speaking in hushed tones about containment, about cleansing. It was not phrased as violence, at least not at first. They spoke of legal inquiries, of seizing custody of the children, of declaring Margaret unfit. But beneath the righteous language lay a darker undercurrent. They did not simply want to remove her influence. They wanted to erase her legacy. Reverend Cutter was the loudest voice. "These children are not her heirs," he thundered. "They are her proof against God. If we allow them to grow, they will not lead Boston, they will consume it." Some suggested exorcism. Others, more pragmatic, argued for confinement, a hidden asylum where the children could be locked away forever. And then came whispers of something even more final: fire. While they plotted, Margaret carried on as though untouchable. She hosted her gatherings with new defiance, her eyes gleaming like a prophetess. She told her inner circle of sycophants that the city would bow in time. That resistance was nothing more than the last cries of the old world before it dies. She even mocked the Reverend's visit, retelling it to her guests as though it were a comedy of fools. But her daughters knew better. Catherine wept in secret, begging her sisters to flee with their children before the city came for them. Elizabeth tried once more to reason with their mother, warning her that the family's enemies were gathering strength. Anne, broken and haunted, began scrawling messages on her chamber walls. "They are coming. The house will burn. The house will burn." The children, too, seemed aware of the growing storm. Nathaniel spoke of the reckoning, as if it were a date already fixed. Clara's drawings grew darker, filled with crude images of men with torches, of gates falling, of flames climbing walls. And Samuel, pale Samuel, stopped speaking altogether. He simply stared, as though watching events already unfold. And so, 2 forces prepared for collision: Margaret's unshakable pride and Boston's rising fear. But history teaches us one lesson without fail. When a community believes it faces the unnatural, when whispers evolve into threats, it does not hesitate. It hunts, and the hunt for the Lawrences was about to begin. The first strike came not in daylight, but in the deep silence of midnight. It was February of 1860, the ground frozen, the Charles River glazed with ice. A small group of men moved through the darkness toward the Lawrence estate, their faces half hidden, their torches wrapped to keep the flames low. They did not come as an open mob. They came as conspirators, intent on breaching the house without awakening the city. At their head was Elias Winthrop, his pride still stung from what Clara had whispered to him weeks before. With him were 3 servants, a carpenter, and a minister's aide. They carried tools, crowbars, ropes, a satchel of oil, not to rob but to expose. Their aim, they told themselves, was to gather proof, to drag out evidence of Margaret's wickedness and show it to Boston at dawn. The mansion loomed before them, its windows black as if the house itself had shut its eyes. They cut through the iron gates, their boots crunching on the snow. No dog barked. No lantern flickered. It was as if the estate had been waiting for them. They reached the servants' entrance, pried it open, and stepped into the hall. The air was suffocating, warmer than outside, yet heavy thick, as though it hadn't been breathed for years. Their torches cast long shadows on the walls, where the wallpaper seemed to ripple faintly as if alive. They made their way toward the nursery. Winthrop wanted to see the children with his own eyes, But before they could reach the stairwell, a sound froze them. Laughter. Not the laughter of children at play, but something smaller, sharper. It echoed from every corridor, bouncing until they could not tell where it began. Clara's laughter, but distorted, as if it belonged to more than one mouth. The carpenter dropped his crowbar. One of the servants muttered a prayer under his breath. And then, without warning, every candle in the hall flared to life, though none of the men had touched them. The shadows leapt high across the ceiling, stretching long, grotesque shapes that writhed like figures in torment. Samuel appeared at the top of the stairs, pale, barefoot, eyes wide. He raised a hand and whispered, "She knows." The men broke. One fled toward the doors, another stumbled into a side passage. Winthrop alone held his ground, trembling, his jaw clenched. He shouted up at the child, "You are a curse upon this city! We will burn this place to its foundation!" But the house answered first. The doors behind him slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The windows shattered inward, though no wind stirred. The men's torches guttered out one by one, leaving them in a darkness alive with sound. Footsteps above, whispers below, the scratching of nails inside the walls. Only one of them made it out alive. A servant, found the next morning staggering barefoot through the snow, eyes glazed with terror, muttering a single phrase over and over. The house woke up. The house woke up. Boston would never hear the full account of what those men saw. But the rumor that spread in its place was far worse. And with that, the city began to turn from whispers to wrath. By dawn, news of the failed intrusion had already spread through Boston. The survivors babbling, "The house woke up," was repeated in taverns, in kitchens, in church vestibules. The names of Winthrop and Endicott were whispered, their absence from society noticed, their fates left unspoken. But one fact was undeniable: the Lawrence mansion had swallowed men whole. Most women would have hidden. Most widows would have shuttered their doors, pleaded innocence, begged for mercy. But Margaret Lawrence was not most widows. When daylight fell across the mansion's facade, she did not retreat, she invited. Within a week, she hosted another gathering grander than any before. Carriages lined the icy street. Lamps burned bright. She welcomed Boston's elite not as a woman under siege, but as a sovereign queen. "You may hear whispers," she told them, "but whispers are born of envy. Look upon my children and judge for yourself." Nathaniel stood beside her, tall as a boy of 8, but with a bearing too sharp, too knowing. Clara displayed her notebooks, filled with drawings of spirals and sigils that unsettled every eye that fell upon them. And Samuel, pale Samuel, simply stared at the guests, unblinking, as if memorizing each face for a trial yet to come. The guests tried to smile, tried to pretend this was nothing more than eccentricity. But beneath their polite murmurs lay terror. For every candle flickered when the children entered, for every footstep echoed twice, and when Clara recited a guest's secret sin aloud, a confession no one else could have known, the illusion of safety shattered. Margaret laughed at their unease. "Fear is the birth cry of progress," she declared. "Do not mistake it for truth. These children are not curses. They are the beginning of a perfected age, and you who dare stand in judgment, you are witnessing the future." But that speech was her fatal mistake, for in Boston, pride could be tolerated, eccentricity could be excused, even whispered scandal could be endured. But defiance, public defiance, against the church, against rival families, against the very fabric of order, that could not be forgiven. The ministers left with thunder in their hearts. The rivals left with vengeance in their eyes. And even those who might have defended her turned away, fearing what association with Margaret Lawrence would cost. For the first time, Margaret had not merely been whispered about, she had declared herself openly. And Boston, a city built on Puritan bones, does not forgive heretics who crown themselves queens. By the spring of 1860, the question was no longer if Margaret Lawrence would fall, it was how. Her defiance had snapped the last thread of Boston's patience. The city's most powerful, ministers, magistrates, and rival patriarchs, gathered in secrecy, united not by friendship, but by fear. They met in the back rooms of churches and in shuttered chambers of City Hall. Some framed their mission as righteous. The widow blasphemes against God's order. Others spoke of civic duty. If we do not act, Boston itself will become infected. But beneath their words ran a single, unspoken truth: the Lawrences had become too dangerous to tolerate. It was decided. The mansion would not be shamed, nor sued, nor seized by law. It would be purged. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. On a night chosen carefully, when the city slept deepest, when the watch was lightest, a band of men would descend upon the Lawrence estate. They would bring fire, oil, and iron. They would drag Margaret and her brood into the night, and whatever could not be dragged would be consumed by flame. The details were set in whispers. The Parkers promised men. The Endicotts promised funding. Reverend Cutter blessed the scheme, declaring it a righteous cleansing. Even a handful of magistrates, cloaked in hypocrisy, agreed to turn their eyes away. But word of plots has a way of traveling, and inside the Lawrence mansion Samuel stirred first. The boy, pale as bone, woke in the dead of night and told his mother Anne, "The fire is coming. They are already here, even if you cannot see them." Anne wept, begged Margaret to flee, to take the children and vanish before the purge. Catherine urged the same, insisting she could spirit Nathaniel away through family allies in Providence. Elizabeth pleaded for reason, one last time, warning her mother that this path ended only in ruin. But Margaret refused. She stood in the flickering candlelight of her study, her notebooks spread before her, her eyes fevered. "They think they can burn destiny," she spat. "Let them come. The house will not fall. My children will not fall. We are beyond their reach." Yet as she spoke, the mansion itself seemed to shudder. The walls creaked though no wind touched them. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of smoke that did not exist. And for the first time even Margaret faltered. The purge was not yet at her door, but its shadow had already entered the house. The night chosen was moonless. A cold wind rolled off the harbor, carrying with it the scent of salt and ash. In the stillness, dozens of men crept down Beacon Hill, their boots muffled by cloth, their faces hidden beneath scarves. Some carried torches wrapped in oil-soaked rags, others bore axes, sledgehammers, and coils of rope. These were not criminals. They were deacons, merchants, and magistrates, men who dined in parlors by day, but now marched like executioners. At their head walked Reverend Cutter, Bible in one hand, a jug of kerosene in the other. His sermon that night would not be delivered from a pulpit, but from flame. When they reached the Lawrence estate, the great iron gate stood ajar, as if inviting them. Some hesitated. "Did they know we'd come?" whispered one. Cutter only grunted and pressed forward. The mansion loomed above, its windows unlit, its walls black against the sky. Yet as the mob approached, a strange unease fell over them. The air felt heavy, thick, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The bravest among them struck the first torch and hurled it at the steps. The flame licked but sputtered, as if the wood refused to burn. Then, without warning, the doors of the mansion creaked open. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret Lawrence stood in the threshold. She wore no cloak, no veil, only a black gown that shimmered faintly in the torchlight. Behind her, in the shadow of the hall, shapes moved, her children. Elizabeth clutching her mother's arm, Catherine with eyes wide and wild, Anne pale as a ghost. And Samuel did not move like a child at all. The boy stepped forward first, bare feet upon the stone. His eyes glowed with a strange wet gleam. The men who had come with steel and fire now froze, their torches trembling in their hands. "Go back," Samuel said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Yet every man heard it as though it had been spoken into his skull. The crowd stirred. One merchant dropped his torch, cursing under his breath. Cutter raised his Bible high. "The devil speaks through this house," he roared. "Do not falter!" But the house itself groaned in reply. The windows rattled though no wind touched them. The very earth beneath the mob's boots seemed to shift, as if the ground itself wanted them gone. Still, the men surged forward. One hurled his torch into the open doorway. It vanished, snuffed in an instant, as though swallowed whole. Another raised his axe, only to stagger back, blood running from his nose, his ears ringing with a sound none but he could hear. Margaret did not flinch. She raised her hand, her voice steady, commanding. "You came to burn my house," she said. "But my house does not burn, it consumes." The words hung heavy in the night, and suddenly the men realized the truth. They had not come to destroy the Lawrence estate. They had walked willingly into its mouth. The first scream split the night like a blade. It belonged to a young clerk, one of the men shoved to the front by braver tongues and weaker spines. He had stepped onto the Lawrence steps, axe raised, and in the blink of an eye the door swallowed him whole. No fire, no blow, no blade. Just gone. His scream echoed from somewhere deep inside the walls, carried out like the last breath of a trapped animal. Panic rippled through the mob. Torches dropped. Men stumbled back, but the gates behind them slammed shut with a crash that shook the ground. Iron on iron. They were sealed in. Inside the doorway, Samuel's pale face hovered in the dark, his mouth slightly open in a grin too wide for a child. His eyes gleamed wet and white, reflecting every torch as though they were stars trapped inside him. He whispered again, "Stay." And stay they did, not by choice, but because their legs locked beneath them, their arms hung useless, their tongues cleaved to their mouths. They were prisoners inside their own bodies, their wills bound by something older than law, older than Boston itself. Margaret stepped down from the threshold, her black gown trailing over the stone. "You thought to cleanse us," she said, her voice carrying across the frozen mob. "But it is Boston that is foul, and tonight Boston is judged." The house answered her, its shutters flung wide though no hands touched them. The windows glowed faint red, as if embers smoldered within. From the chimney poured not smoke, but a low, thick mist that rolled down the walls like breath from a slumbering beast. One by one, the men began to fall. Some dropped to their knees, blood leaking from their ears. Others convulsed, clutching at their throats, their torches extinguished in the dirt. Those who tried to run found themselves swallowed by the mist, vanishing like moths into smoke. Cutter, trembling, raised his Bible with the last of his strength. "God," he tried to cry, but the word never finished. His mouth hung open in silence as his body jerked once, twice, then crumpled lifeless onto the stones. By dawn, not a soul remained alive in the courtyard. The gates swung open again, creaking softly, as if nothing had ever happened. The mansion stood untouched, its walls black and silent, its windows calm. But Boston would never forget. The families of those men, Parkers, Endicotts, magistrates, ministers, found no bodies to bury, only whispers. No court dared accuse Margaret Lawrence, for who could accuse a woman when an entire city's elite had simply vanished? The Lawrences remained, but they were no longer merely a family. They were a curse stitched into Boston's marrow, a shadow in its proudest streets. Some swore the house still stands hidden, waiting. Others claimed the children were spirited away, raised in secret, shaping fortunes and wars under new names. And Margaret herself. Some said she lived until her hair turned white. Others swore she never aged at all. But one truth endures. Boston tried to burn the Lawrence name from history, and instead it fed that name with its blood. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the city's brick walls groan against the cold, some say you can still hear a boy's whisper threading through the streets. "Stay."